I tell you, if you don't know what book to turn to by now, we're in a world of hurt. The book of Acts, and chapter 24. The book of Acts, and chapter number 24. Darlene and I have plans to go home tomorrow. I think instead I'm gonna get online tonight and find somewhere it is not raining. Wherever that is, I want to go there. Amen. Oh my, I don't think you have, but in our travels, we have been in rain since the 1st of October. I feel green growing on me and all kinds of things. It's been so long since we've been in the dry. But nonetheless, well, at least I'm going to winterize the trailer before we leave in the morning. When we get home, we'll just park it until the end of March. So a good part of that time we'll be overseas. But though it's raining, I won't have to get up in snow and ice. That's a plus. Amen. Thank the Lord for that.
The book of Acts in chapter 24, and we left off with Paul before Felix last night. Felix is going to be replaced, and it very well could be that the reason for his replacement would have to do with his inability to rightly deal with the Jews and the problems that they were creating. We don't know, but that is a matter of speculation. He is going to be set aside, and there are some things that he has to be answerable to. And in his stead, they're bringing in Festus. This is not a Gunsmoke character. This is an actual biblical character. Some of you might not even know Mr. Festus, but amen. But if you would look in verse 27 of chapter, is that right? Yes, chapter 24 in verse 27. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound, left him in prison. So when he said he comes into his room, he's not coming into his house. He's coming to take his place there in Caesarea. And Felix, by the way, I'll go ahead and say this about the folks in Jerusalem, about Felix, about Festus, about Agrippa, about Nero coming up. Every single one of them, the Sanhedrin included, knew Paul was innocent. There were false charges that are brought against him, and they all knew that he was innocent. But they're toying with him, they're playing with him. I mean, 2 years at a time. By the time Festus comes into office, Paul has already been 2 years in jail with nothing concluded. There's no charge. Well, other than what the Sanhedrin brought against him, there is no charge. He's not been found guilty of anything. And yet they're still holding him in jail after 2 years. I was in Caesarea a couple of years ago. It really is a beautiful place, right on the Mediterranean Sea. Between the Sanhedrin and Felix, Festus, Agrippa, these people are they're just toying with Paul. The only reason Felix and Festus will keep him in jail is they believe it's gaining points for them with the Jews. And they want that. They want some leverage with the Jews. And so they're keeping him in jail. In chapter 25 and beginning in verse 1, it's made known that the Jews want Paul back in Jerusalem. I tell you, Ananias he just can't let this thing go, can he? Right. He wants Paul back in Jerusalem because he knows very well that if he gets Paul released from Caesarea and he makes a journey, he wouldn't do it this time with 400 soldiers. Ananias knew that he knew enough crooks that would kill him before he even got to Jerusalem. Right. They knew that. And so they're asking Festus. Festus he made a trip to Jerusalem, and they're asking Festus, hey, how about sending that guy Paul back to us so that we can judge him here in Jerusalem? But Festus's short answer was, why don't you guys come down to Caesarea, and we'll meet with Paul and we'll talk about it. And they will make a trip there. And Paul is going to be, he's going to be asked to come before the judgment seat. And when you watch these characters, Ananias and others who make up the Sanhedrin, it just shows you to the depths that they have gone. Reminding us of the Lord speaking of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, woe unto you. The religious leaders in Israel had just become so depraved in their behavior. And the Lord had pronounced woes on them already, and they have only gotten worse as time has gone on. So finally, in verse number 9 of chapter 25, Festus is going to ask Paul, are you willing to go back to Jerusalem? Well, that would be like going to a lower court. As a matter of fact, Festus is going to make it known to the Apostle Paul that he would go too. But Festus and Paul both knew that if Paul got before the Sanhedrin, Festus had nothing to do with that. Now, when it came to Roman law, he had everything to do with that. But he had nothing to do with the religious law or the Jewish law, which the Sanhedrin would be over. Even if they would let him come into those meetings, he still wouldn't have any influence or power. And so Paul is not about to fall into that trap. So here is something that we must see. Look, if you would please, at verse number 9 of chapter 25. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? Well, he would not be judged before Felix if he went back to Jerusalem. And Paul knew that well. Verse number 10, then said Paul. Now, this is like a bolt of lightning in their conversation. It's like a burst of thunder in their conversation. It's like a cannon is between the two of them and it goes off while they're talking. I'm telling you, verse 10 is huge. Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. Amen. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. In verse number 11, for if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. How about that? But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. And here are the words that I believe Festus will remember until the day he dies. I appeal to Caesar. I appeal unto Caesar. I don't think for a moment that Festus ever factored that possibility in. Yeah. Now, I know he knew Paul could. But you see, appealing to Caesar, generally speaking, was for someone who had been in a trial and now he had lost every appeal that he had made. And now, as a last resort, he's going to appeal to the Supreme Court. I want to stand. And that right without controversy was given to every Roman citizen. Now, here's the dilemma that Festus is in. He knows very well that Paul has done nothing worthy of death or imprisonment. He's just been toying with him so that he could play with between him and the Jews and the Sanhedrin. But now it is Festus who has to write a letter to Nero and tell him why he is sending Paul to him. I'm telling you, talk about between a rock and a hard place. I'm sure at this moment he's wondering, where is Felix? Where is Felix? Would you come back? Oh, yeah. No, I mean, this is big stuff. He's thinking in his mind, he has to be. What is Nero going to think of me when I send this guy to him? And he listens to him, and he knows the man hasn't done anything wrong. The Sanhedrin had no business bothering with him, nor did the Roman powers have any reason to bother with him. And as busy as I am, they're bothering me with this stuff? I mean, there must have been a backlog, because it's going to be 2 years after he gets to Rome before he can ever see Nero to begin with. You can imagine how furious he would be. No, Festus can imagine how furious Nero is going to be, the Caesar, when Paul gets there before him. So I've got every reason to believe that in his thinking, he had played this game like a chess set. And he made this move and he made this move, and now he's saying to Paul, could I send you back to Jerusalem? Paul knew if he went back to Jerusalem, he'd die. He knew that. And so he said, I appeal to Caesar. Smack Festus in the face. Because you see, now Festus can do nothing. Festus can't even set him free. It's all over. Once a Roman citizen has said, I want to stand before Caesar, he's got to go before Caesar. I'm sure it would have been appealing to Paul had Festus said, how about I just let you go? But boy, it'd have been even worse on him then if that word got back to Rome. And so he has no options now. Now he's going to do some other things, like he's going to bring Agrippa in. Agrippa was not, his power was not over that of Festus's. Festus's was over his. So he's asking a lesser power to come in. You say, in the hopes that he might let him go? No, I think Agrippa would have let him go. He's asking him to come in so maybe Agrippa can tell him something to put in that letter. I've got to have some help. I've got to write a letter, and I don't know what to say. But Agrippa might. And so he's going to try some other things, some maneuvers, but none of them is going to get him away from the fact he's got to write a letter. He just needs some help on the wording of that letter that's going to go to Nero. So he will invite, in verse 13, Agrippa and Bernice to come to Caesarea. Agrippa and Bernice are brothers and sisters. Though everyone is of the opinion that they had a family relationship between themselves. Never had any children, but they had, it was just a strange set of events. But they were brother and sister, and at this time, Bernice is probably 19 at the most. She's a teenage girl. And so he invites them to Caesarea, and they obviously do come. And Festus tells Agrippa about this man, Paul. Agrippa was rather anxious to hear it. He said, and he could have, by the way, said, no, I don't care anything about this guy. I don't want anything to do with him. But it sounded like pretty good sport. Yeah, I'll sit in, and Bernice, of course, we'll sit in, and we'll listen to what this guy has to say. And so it's all set up. Festus declares that he saw no reason that Paul should be put to death, but he needs something to write back. So Agrippa comes in, he meets the Apostle Paul, and he gives him permission to speak. What is behind all of this? We're not 100% sure on any of the part of these guys, these characters. But we can speculate a great many things, and probably are right. So he's going to come in and he's going to stand before Agrippa. We're not going to take time to read what he said, because this is the third time he's going to give his testimony, and that's pretty much what he's going to do. Because his testimony will include what stirred up the Sanhedrins and so on, but it also will include his salvation experience. And he wants Agrippa and Festus and anybody else that'll listen, that's what he wants them to listen to. He's going to get to do the very same thing before Nero. It's going to be a little while longer before he does, but he's going to get to do it nonetheless. Agrippa, as I mentioned, did not have power over Festus. However, he did have great influence. And perhaps that's what Felix was looking to capitalize on. Also, he would have understood the Jews far better. Festus really didn't have any knowledge of the Jews and what they believed and how they operated. But Agrippa would have had a great deal of knowledge in those things. And of course, he could help with the letter. You see, Agrippa was in the Herod line. His dad had James killed. Remember? And then he had Peter imprisoned and would have killed him, but God staged a jailbreak and got him out. But that was his intent. It just tickled the Jewish people so much that Herod killed James that he said, hallelujah, I'll take it a step further. I'll kill Peter also. And God said, well, let me help you out with that killing. And God killed Herod because he received glory that should have only been given to God. You remember that. We covered that sometime this week. John Phillips says, one way and another, Herods had been mixed up in the story right from the start. He said Herod the Great had massacred the babes of Bethlehem. You remember that? 2 years old and under. Herod Antipas had murdered John the Baptist. A few years ago when I was in Jordan, I had the privilege of going out to the site. Actually, this particular place that Herod had built was in Jordan. And it's a long, steep walk to get up there. But once you get on the top of the hill, overlooking the Dead Sea, there was a palace there. And that's where John the Baptist was brought to be imprisoned. Not really, as the crow flies, not very far from where John baptized the Lord and had his preaching ministry. Even on the road in probably a half hour's time, you could be there driving. So it wasn't very far away. So he was being held there. And remember, Herodes' daughter danced. And that floor, that very floor has been excavated. You can walk on it. It's right on top of that hill. She danced on that floor and then, of course, was given the opportunity to just get anything she wanted up to half the kingdom. She asked her mom, can you help me with this? I'm going to get a prize. And she said, yes, I want you to ask for the head of John the Baptist on a charger. I wonder how much she gave up to get that. Now that's hatred, isn't it? And of course, the word is going to be given, and he's being held in jail or in prison right there on that spot. And pretty soon someone comes in with a silver charger, and John the Baptist's head is on it. These are the Herods. Great family, huh? And then, of course, Herod Agrippa I that had James killed and would have killed Peter. And now this Herod. And this Herod could be the very first one that ever hears a clear presentation of the gospel. He doesn't know what to do with it. But nonetheless, he's going to hear it. After or during Paul's presentation, of course, Festus is going to say, Paul, thou art mad. I mean, by that he meant he was crazy. Listen, Paul was the only sane man in the room. He says, you're crazy, you're mad. And in response to that, Paul isn't going to say to Felix, hey, what about this? But he's going to turn to Agrippa. And he's going to say to King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? Hey, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? And of course, he's going to respond, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And of course, we have a song that we still sing in our churches, Almost Persuaded. And it comes from this idea, this text of Scripture. Now, Paul is standing before the group, the judgment seat, more than likely with chains on both wrists, maybe his ankles as well, and a soldier on each side of him holding that chain. I mean, he's a dangerous man. He's done nothing but gone about the country seeing people saved and their names written in the Lamb's Book of Life. This is a dangerous guy. And so they're holding him there in chains. And when Agrippa says, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian, I have no doubt but that Paul held his arms up. And those chains dangled from his arms. And he said, I wish that not almost, but altogether, thou wast as I am, except these chains. I don't know. Could you have that frame of mind if you had been bounced around and thrown in jail and left for 2 years without any word on what's going to happen next? But somehow the grace of God had mastered the Apostle Paul, and he was able to give him a clear witness. Not only him, but Bernice and Herod Agrippa. All of them are getting this message. Almost thou persuadest me, Paul said. I would not that almost, but altogether. Agrippa saw that he was innocent, and he's going to tell Festus so. Now think about this. This is Festus's trump card. He has Agrippa in, and Agrippa is going to hear Paul, and Agrippa, being the knowledgeable man that he is, knowing the Jews as well as he does, he's going to be able to form this letter perfectly. Agrippa says to Festus, the man's not guilty, I'd let him go. I imagine his countenance just went right through the floor. Oh, my soul, you're a great help. If you are responding to me this way, what is Nero going to say? And I'm going to tell you, you cannot overvalue to these guys the words of Nero. Right. He is life or death. So all of his hope is gone now, and Agrippa, that he hoped would help him, has done him absolutely no good. Oh, by the way, I wanted to read this. Phillips again, he says, now Festus wanted him, Paul, to go back to Jerusalem, where the same fanatical assassins, very hungry indeed by now, were all too eager to get their hands on him. Of course, it'd been 2 years. Yeah? And then Phillips, if you ever met Dr. Phillips, your first impression would not be that he's a comedian. Yeah. He was a very humble but very serious-minded man. And so when I read this, I just chuckled. I could not imagine him saying something like this. But he said, yeah, they want to get their hands on him because they're pretty hungry by now. 2 years if they kept their vow, they have not eaten. I would say that 40 died, and there may be 40 more going to take their place. But my guess is they broke that vow. Yeah. And they might have just had a party, and all of them got together at one time and said, let's just all do it, be done with it, But I thought that was pretty humorous when I read that. So now preparation is going to be made, chapter 27, verse 1. Preparation is going to be made now for Paul, of course, with a soldier at his side. And not just him. He's not the only one, prisoner that's going to be making this trip. They first have to find a ship that's sailing at this time. Wasn't always easy. And then once they found a ship, they'd have to find one that could accommodate not just Paul and the soldier, but there's going to be a great many others that are going to be traveling as well. But they finally found one, and they're going to set sail. Now they're going to go through a number of ports, undoubtedly selling maybe some of what they have on board, and maybe being laden down with further things that will be shipped to either a port between there and Rome, or would be going all the way to Rome. So they're going to stop at a number of ports, but eventually they're going to end up in Fair Havens. And they will cast anchor at Fair Havens. And by this time, the weather is getting pretty bad. From the middle of September till the middle or late part of November, ancient sailing vessels could not sail up and down the Mediterranean Sea. If you have had any interest in cruises, you will know that cruise ships go from here to the Mediterranean in the spring. But they leave in the fall, the Mediterranean, and come back here. Now, are they capable of those cruise ships capable in these days of handling the storms that go down through the Mediterranean? Yes, they are. But of course, if you have 5,000 guests on the ship and they're all seasick, that's really not a promotion for your company. And so they have transatlantic trips that you can take. You can go from here to Europe, or you can go from Europe back to here, and that happens in the spring and in the fall of the year. And it does that simply because of the weather patterns that are in the Caribbean and in the Mediterranean. So when Paul would say to someone, I can't come see you right now, but perhaps I can later, and maybe I can winter with you. What Paul was saying was, I can't sail up and down the Mediterranean for these 3 months or so, and so I have to find a harbor to stay in and until the ships start sailing again. Now, what this ship is attempting to do is get ahead of those storms and get to Rome, or get ahead of those storms and get to a port that they don't mind spending 2 or 3 months in, because they're probably around the first part of October by the time they get to Fair Havens. So in Fair Havens now, they have spent their time there, and the captain of the ship says it's time to hoist those anchors up and get the sails in the air and move on. And Paul said, I really wouldn't advise that. Now keep in mind, Paul was a preacher, he was not a sailor. But according to 2 Corinthians 11, he had certainly been in 2 or 3 shipwrecks. Right. He knew something about traveling up and down the Mediterranean in these ships. And he told these guys, he said, we ought not go now. He said, I'm telling you, it's going to be too dangerous. And they said, well, this little port is not commodious. I've always pretended, at least, that the sailors were saying there just wasn't enough action, just wasn't enough going on. That probably had part to do with it, but also the harbor at Fair Havens was open to the sea. and there would be some stormy times. Now, the ship would be safe and the sailors would be safe as well, but there would be some times it would be very uncomfortable when the storms came through. But whatever the case, the men had decided we're going. And so they do pull the sails, hoist the sails, they do pull their anchors up, and they set out to sea. They hardly even get out to sea until they're in a storm. You can imagine maybe Paul is sitting below deck thinking, told you. And later on, he is going to tell them, I told you. You know, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to say, well, I told you so. But Paul's going to. He's going to say, I told you so. So they're out in the sea now, and the storm is raging. This storm that is raging today is going to last for 14 days. Now, I don't know if you've ever been out in the ocean before or not in a storm. Growing up in Panacea, I was out a number of times in shrimp boats, fishing boats, and so on, where we would get caught in a storm. I remember getting caught in one on a shrimp boat one night, and it was a horrible storm, and the boat started leaking. So we had an air-cooled engine. We started it up and started pumping water out of the ship or out of the boat, and that was going along pretty good until the storm got so bad it flooded the engine out, and now we have nothing to get the water out with. But finally we made it to the inlet to the bay that we were trying to get to, and all of the channel lights were out. None of them, not one was burning. But we had a very good captain, and he was able to negotiate his way through the pass and got into the bay, and we tied the boat up at the dock. You know, I never went back to see whether it sunk or not. I just about had all that I wanted to begin with, and it was only one night. Just one night. Paul and these people, 276 of them on this ship, they're going to be on this thing for 14 days. 2 weeks, tossed to and fro. Not all of these people are sailors. But I'm guessing even the sailors are getting pretty sick by now. You know, by the time you get a week into it, and you can hardly stop to get a drink of water. You can hardly sit still to eat a bite of food. And this thing is just being tossed up. I remember when we were down in the Caribbean, in Grenada. My partner had a boat, and we took it and went up to an island up above us and put a tent up and had a meeting. They called them a crusade. We were coming back, and we got in a storm. It was a 28-foot cabin cruiser. I'm telling you, the waves would take us up until you couldn't see water. And then all of a sudden, that wave goes out from under you. And that boat crashes down into the ocean and just shudders like it's going to break into 1,000 pieces. My partner that I was working with, he got on the radio. Now, neither of us knew nothing about running a boat. Hey, when I was a boy growing up, I was on boats all the time, but I never ran one. I was just on it. But now here we are out in this, and it was a place called Kickhamjinny, and it was called that because it was always turbulent, whether there was a storm or not. And the reason it was is because it's where the Caribbean and the Atlantic met, and there was volcanic activity 800 feet down under the water. And so it just rolled and tossed and all the time anyway. But now on top of that, we're in a tropical front. And it would just take that thing up and crash it. My partner, he got on the radio and he said, Grenada Coast Guard, Grenada Coast Guard. Well, he tried that several times. They didn't answer. So he called Spice Island Marina. Spice Island Marina. That was one of the marinas on the island. Nothing. St. George's Marina, St. George's Marina. Somebody come back. And St. George's Marina. Nothing. Finally, he said, if there's anybody out there, will you please talk to me? There wasn't. No, I mean, it was dead. It was dead silence. Now, again, Took us maybe 4 hours to make the crossing and to get into we didn't look for anything in particular. We just wanted an inlet on the Caribbean side we could get in. And we finally got in there and got the generator out and dried it as best we could, started it up and made us a pot of coffee. We wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere. This is 2 weeks. They're going to get a little reprieve. They'll come up behind the island of Clauda. And there they will frat the ship. They ran cords underneath the ship, tightened them up to keep the planks from coming apart. And then all of a sudden, about the time they got that done, the wind drove them out from behind the protection of the island, and now they're headed toward North Africa. The boat is heavy, and they're hauling cargo, they're hauling extra equipment, and evidently Paul got involved with them, and they're just throwing everything overboard they can, trying to lighten the boat so it can stay up. As a matter of fact, they said all hope was gone. Yeah. Think about that. All hope was gone. They never expected to live. They just wanted to live a little longer. Yeah. I mean, they knew they were going to die. But they struggled to get the last breath they could possibly get. And while they're in this struggling, hungry, thirsty, seasick mode, Paul steps out on the deck and says, "Cheer up, the boat's going to sink." Wouldn't you want to just slap his jaws? Cheer up, the boat is going to sink. Now, I didn't mention it earlier, but along with Paul, Aristarchus and Luke are going to be traveling with him. Actually, on this cruise they're taking down the Mediterranean, they're not mentioned, but they go with Paul as his servants. I want you to think about that for a moment. Aristarchus was a notable man. Luke was a physician. But they humbled themselves to be Paul's servants just so they could make this arduous journey with him and serve him. Isn't that amazing? You know, David had the same kind of attitude. David, in, I believe it's chapter 28 of 1 Chronicles, he approaches the Lord and he says, "Lord, I've built me a beautiful palace. I have a nice house. I'd like to build a house for you." And the Lord said, "David, you've been a man of war. You've shed blood. I don't want you to build me a house." Well, he said, "The next king will be Solomon. Can he build you a house?" And the Lord said, "Yes, Solomon can build me a house." And David said, "Can I get the materials together?" Think about that. King David knew it would never be called David's temple. It'll be called Solomon's temple. David, in essence, said, "I don't have to play first fiddle. I just want in the orchestra." Amen. Aristarchus and Luke, I believe, had that same opinion. We don't have to be elevated. Just let us participate. Let us serve Paul and make it as easy for him as possible to make this arduous journey. He's been in jail in Jerusalem already. He's been in jail in Caesarea for 2 years already. Let us go with him. And so God permitted them to go. So they're in this ship up and down, and all hope is gone as well. And then Paul stands up and says, "Cheer up, the boat's going to sink." But he said, "I've talked to the Lord. And if you'll listen to me now, not one soul will be lost." Amen. I don't know how much of that they believed, but he had their ear. Amen. I'm going to tell you, a lot has changed between Fairhavens and now. And they're ready to pay attention to the preacher that doesn't know anything. Right. And they do listen to him. they've stopped worried about making money. Everything's been thrown overboard. Even extra tackling has been thrown overboard. And now they start sounding. That is, they're testing the depth of the water. Probably a chunk of lead on the end of a line dropped over the bow. When it hits the bottom, they reel it up, measure it, see how deep it is. And they do that just every once in a while, sounding to see how deep the water is. And what they're finding out is that it's getting more and more shallow. Now, they're being tossed to and fro, winds blowing, rains being blown, probably sideways across the Mediterranean. Sails are ragged. Men are sick and absolutely certain that they're going to die. And so in the pitch of night, they're afraid that the ship is going to be driven up on some rocks or a reef, and they won't even know what direction to swim in to get to a place of safety. Might not even be a place of safety. And so what they decide to do is put 4 anchors off the stern of the ship and bring their sails down and hope for morning. Right. Well, praise the Lord, morning did come. And they were right. When light came in, no sunshine, it's still storming. But when it got light enough that they could see, they saw an island in front of them. Melita, the island of Malta. And they see a creek coming down out of that island and into the ocean. And they have determined now that what they're going to do is they're going to get the bow of that ship turned toward that creek, getting maybe the deepest water and softest sand that they can find. And then they're going to hoist the sails and just cut the anchors loose and let the wind drive the ship into the shore. Well, when they do that, of course, the bow is going to lodge in the sand, but the stern is still going to be in floating water. And the ship's just going to be pushed back and forth until it comes apart. Well, in the process of getting ready, there's some fellows who decided they'd take the lifeboat, and we'll just let these other guys perish and we'll take the lifeboat. And Paul said to his soldiers, said, hey, listen, if anybody leaves this ship, I can't guarantee the safety of anyone else. And these old boys are such believers now that they go up with their sword and cut that thing loose and let the lifeboat drop into the ocean and crash. Well, they get everything ready. Paul says now, if you can swim, some believe they're probably as much as a quarter of a mile away from shore at this time. I don't know how they would know that, probably, again, just speculation. But anyway, they're some distance away from the land. And so he says, Paul says, now we're getting ready to cut these things loose. And once the bow lodges in the sand, if you can swim, I'd suggest you dive over and swim to shore as soon as you can. If you don't know how to swim, just grab you a board and paddle your way in, because there's going to be plenty of them in just a minute. And so that old ship, she finds her lodging, tossed to and fro, men diving overboard, swimming to shore, others grabbing boards, floating in. But when all is said and done, 276 men stand safely on the shores of Malta. Amen. God did not allow a single one of them to be lost to the sea. Might I remind you this evening that one of these days this old ship of Zion is going to cast anchor on the shores of our eternal home. Amen. And we're going to get off and walk on streets of gold. Amen. And God's not going to lose a single one of us. Amen. Every one of us will arrive. Well, they're on the island now, and they're cold, they're wet, they're worn and weary, but they're standing on solid ground. It probably doesn't feel like it. Yeah. I imagine they're still, feel like they're bobbling around, but they're on solid ground and they're alive. And so they start getting wood together. And they found, by the way, that the native people there were very friendly. They were hospitable. And so they started getting firewood together, and they got a fire started. And Paul joins in, and he goes over and he gets him an armload of wood. And then he came and he threw his wood on the fire. And when he did, not unbeknown to him, there was a serpent in the wood, and it latched onto his hand. And he shook him off in the fire. And those people looked at him. I imagine the 275 that were sailing with him, as well as the people of the island, they looked at him because they expected that he would get a fever and he would swell up and die. What they said was this: God tried to kill him out in the ocean, and he couldn't do it. So he's going to kill him with a snake. Well, Paul neither got a fever, nor did he swell up, neither did he die. And so they said he's God. We are so fickle. There's a part of the country that I used to preach in a lot more than I do now. There were several churches in the same area, and I would have in times past be in that area up to a half dozen times a year, preaching meetings. And the churches in those days would support one another. And I can remember one family in particular. I'd be in a church preaching, and the preacher would say, anybody got a word of testimony? And always the husband or wife, one would get up and say, I mean with tears, I just love our church. I just love our pastor. I tell you, I'm so proud to be a member here. Well, 3 months later, I'd be in the area preaching in another church. Preacher asked for testimonies in that church. One of them would stand up. We just love our preacher. We just love our church. We're just so glad to be here. I know some of those churches, they belonged to, or have belonged to, at least 3 times. They just make their rounds. Somebody hurts their feelings, they bounce off to another church. Isn't that pitiful? Yes. That's no good. That's no good. If God has led you to be a part of Memorial Baptist Church, then just nail your feet to the floor and say, when times are good, I'm going to stay right here. When times are bad, I'm still going to stay right here. Amen. Yeah. We ought not ever make a decision because we're mad. Amen. And what you'll find is, when you're not mad, you'll not want to make a decision. Amen? And I can assure you of this, that whatever problem you have here, you're going to have the same problem wherever you go, because there's people there. They used to tell about the guy that was shipwrecked. I hadn't heard that story in such a long time. That's right. That's right. He was shipwrecked and he was on the island right by himself. But a couple of years later, somebody found him and looked up there, and there's 3 buildings that he had built. And they said, well, what is this? And he said, well, that's my house. That's where I live. And that one over there is my church. And they said, well, what's this other one over here? He said, that's the church I used to belong to. Lord, help us not be so fickle-minded. They said, oh, he's such a sinner, God's going to kill him. Oh, no, he's God. Paul, of course, is going to be used of the Lord to heal some folks. People are going to hear the gospel. That's a wonderful thing. See, they're going to be there 3 months. That was the storm season. They're going to be there 3 months. Another ship will come through. They'll get on that ship, and they'll sail to Rome. They will disembark, and then it's still going to be a journey into Rome. Even if you took a cruise, you say, I'm going to take a transatlantic, and you sailed from South Florida to Rome. Well, you don't sail to Rome. You sail to a city over on the coast, and then, generally speaking, you take a train, about a 45-minute trip into Rome. And so they're not sailing, obviously, right into Rome because there's no ocean in Rome. But they will sail close, and they'll get off on a road, a Roman road. Brother West, you know anything about that Roman road? The Appian Way, the West, and Darlene and myself, we were in Rome a few years ago, and we got on a bus and went out to the south part of the city, and we actually walked on the very stones that Paul would have walked on. Cars drive across the road. I mean, you're talking about a road 2,000 years old. It's still being used for cars, and we just walked up and down that road, and we'd stop just every once in a while and just look down at those stones. I mean, they weren't that different than any other stone that you'd see most anywhere else in the world, except that some of those stones felt the soles of Paul's shoes as he made his way into Rome. For 2 years, Paul will be under house arrest. He has a soldier, and they will come in. I think they switch out about 4 times a day. But soldiers will be there. So he can't escape. But he's allowed to have believers come in, friends come in and visit him. And so though he doesn't have the liberty to go and do just anything he wants to, at the same time, he's not really bound in a prison either. And so it was a much more comfortable setting. And he's going to be in prison there for 2 years. And then he's going to stand before Nero. Nero, in the beginning, first 5 or 6 years of his reign, Nero was a rather moderate man. He wasn't radical in one direction or another, but something happened. He hated Christians. He would actually kill Christians just to use their bodies as torches for his orgies. Big parties. Hey, where'd you get the light? Oh, we went over to the other side of town, found some Christians and killed them. He hated Christians. Now Paul is going to have to stand before this man. And he does stand before him. And pretty interesting it is indeed. He's going to write Timothy and tell him about the experience that he had and how he stood. He said everyone had forsaken him. He said, I stood alone before the lion, speaking of Nero. But he said, the Lord stood with me.
Amen.
The Lord stood with me, and he was able to preach the gospel by way of his testimony to Nero. Guarantee that had never been done before and probably was not done after. But if Nero is in hell tonight, it isn't Paul's fault. Because he gave his very life and health to fight through everything he fought through to make it there on that occasion where God met with him twice, once in Caesarea and again in the ocean voyage, and said, Paul, you must testify in Rome. And lo and behold, there he was. Now, from there, tradition tells us that Paul was released for a little while. Some believe he went back to Macedonia and perhaps Asia Minor. Others believe that he went on to Spain. He certainly longed to go to Spain. As a matter of fact, his hope was that he would stop off in Rome on his way to Spain. It didn't quite work that way. Tradition would tell us that around 67 or 68 AD, Paul's head was severed. And his life here on this earth was over. But being dead, he yet speaketh. Paul's ministry is still having an awesome impact even until our very day. I won't preach this to you, and I have purposefully attempted not to look at my notes because, believe me, we could be here another week just, I think, to cover just what we had for tonight. I want to share this with you before we close. Some things Paul learned of God in the storm. One, he saw God's power. Paul learned that God could not only reach down and pull him out of the storm, but that he could protect him through the storm. And it might be that you have been in a long time battle in your heart. Well, don't give up. The same God that could deliver you from that trouble can also deliver you in that trouble. He saw God's power. Secondly, he saw God's provision. With or without the boat, I can take care of you. And we might ask ourselves tonight, what am I holding on so tenaciously that I think I can fall back on if God fails me? Let it go.
Amen.
Just let it go. He saw God's provision. Thirdly, he saw God's providence. Who's going to witness in Malta? God looks out and he says, oh, here I have an island and these heathen people have not heard the gospel. What am I going to do about this? Oh, my soul, I've got a preacher out there floating around in the middle of the Mediterranean. Next thing you know, the ship is crashed on shore in Malta. And these people who had never heard the Gospels
Amen.
going to be able to hear it. The providence of God. Fourthly, the protection of God. God is going to protect him from the storm. He's going to protect him from the serpent. This life is not altogether easy. And you might look at people around you and you might think, well, they're at ease in Zion. You have no earthly idea what's going on in their hearts, in their minds, in their lives. It's a veil of tears, and it is a trail of sorrows. There's no question. But Paul learned that even in those desperate hours, he served a God that could protect him. And then finally, he saw God's promises. God promised him, he said, Paul, you're going to go to Rome and you're going to witness on my behalf. He saw that promise come to pass. Hey, you believe in God, believe also in me, Jesus said. He has gone this very hour to prepare a place for us. He said, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. We can absolutely trust the promises of God.
Amen.
I hope this amazing story will whet your appetite. I hope you'll study it more. I hope you'll go back and maybe pick out one of the epistles in the areas where Paul saw a church started. Thessalonica, he wrote back to the Thessalonians. Philippi, when he was under house arrest for 2 years in Rome, you think, well, his ministry's over. He's in jail. It's done. It wasn't done. 4 epistles were written from that imprisonment. Ephesians, Philippians, Philemon, and was it Colossians? I can't remember. I think it was Colossians. Were written during that imprisonment. Later on, he's going to be in the Mamertine prison, where he will write Timothy. He'll write at least 2 Timothy from the Mamertine prison. You talk about an awful place. They said in the Mamertine prison, and the West and I also were able to go by where the prison is, they said it would be so bad and prisoners would get so weak, the rats would eat them. Can you imagine Paul at this? He calls himself in Philemon, Paul the Aged. Can you imagine all that he's been through, the beatings and the stonings, the miles that he's covered? I'm just going to guess that arthritis was in every joint of his body. And he is in this cold, damp, dark dungeon. That's why he writes Timothy and says, bring my coat. Get to me before winter if you can. That will be his last earthly home. But oh, what a contrast when his head fell to the ground and his soul descended to God. And so will it be for us one glad day. God bless you.